Firstly, I want to reflect on human needs and innovation from week 41. At the start of this course, I honestly thought innovation was about ideas. Good ideas, small ideas, maybe even clever ideas. I believe that if a solution was technically solid or logically efficient, it would naturally succeed. But very early on, something started to unsettle that belief. I began to notice that many innovations don't fail because the idea is bad. They fail because they don't connect deeply enough to real human needs. Week 41, especially the part about how innovations are born, was a turning point for me. It pulled my attention away from solutions and forced me to sit longer with the problem itself, and more importantly, with the people experiencing that problem. Instead of asking, what can we build? I started asking, what gap exists? And then, why does it exist for this person, in this context, at this moment? On the surface, that sounds like a small shift, but for me, it was uncomfortable. I like clarity, I like momentum, I like moving forward. And week 41 made me realize that I often chase clarity too early. Exploring human needs forced me to slow down, to tolerate uncertainty, and to accept that innovation often starts with clear answers. Frameworks like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, the Kano model, and the Max Nipp's view of fundamental human needs didn't hand me solutions. They gave me lenses. They helped me see that not all needs are equal and that solving the wrong need can make even a brilliant innovations irrelevant. So what stayed with me most was the idea that the innovators don't invent needs. They notice gaps that already exist and they choose which one are worth responding to. Slowing down to understanding human needs also made me notice something about myself. It made me reflect on how I express understanding. My initial reflections in week 41 were written as very condensed, bullet based notes. They made perfect sense to me, but when I revisited them, I realized something uncomfortable. Clarity in my own head does not automatically translate into clarity for others. Reworking that material into a more explanatory form forced me to slow down and articulate why these ideas mattered to me and not just what they were. And that's when it clicked. This course wasn't only about understanding the concepts, it was also about learning how to communicate insights in a human and meaningful way. Since then, I have noticed a shift in how I think, not just academically, but in everyday problem solving. I pause more. I question whether something is truly needed or simply convenient. I've started to see my future self less as someone who builds solutions quickly and more as someone who first learns how to understand people deeply. This reflection on human needs became the foundation for how I approach the rest of the course. Now, I want to talk about changes in mindset. In week 42, my understanding of what it means to be a change agent shifted quite deeply. Before this course, I thought change agents were mainly people who push ideas forward, people who persuade, convince, or lead from the front. I associated the change with strong opinions and the fast decisions. But during this week, that picture started to break. Through the readings and interview work, a very different pattern kept showing up. The same characteristics appeared again and again: resilience, adaptability, curiosity, and the most importantly, the ability to listen rather than convince. That repetition made me pause. It challenged my earlier assumptions that change is driven mainly by authority or persuasion. Instead, I began to see that effective change often starts much more quietly. What stood out to me personally was the emphasis on listening. I realized that strong change agents don't begin with solutions, they begin with understanding. This connected directly to what I had learned earlier about human needs. If innovation is about closing a gap, then change agents are the one willing to sit with uncertainty long enough to truly understand that gap before trying to fix it. The interview work made this insight feel real. Instead of heroic stories of instant success, I noticed patterns of patience, failure, and continuous learning. That helped me see change not as a single moment but as a process. A change agent is not someone who has all the answers, but someone who stays engaged even when outcomes are unclear. This week also made me reflect on myself. I noticed a shift in how I approach problems. I'm less focused on jumping to solutions and more comfortable asking questions, validating assumptions, and accepting that the meaningful change take time. In that sense, this course didn't just add knowledge, it reshaped how I think and how I act. Looking ahead, this mindset feels especially important for my future self. Whether I work in technology, education, or business, I now see that lasting change depends less on convincing others and more on learning with them. That's perspective I didn't have before this course, and it's one I intend to carry forward. Now I want to talk about making innovation successful. When I first thought about innovation success, I mostly thought about outcomes. Did it get adopted? Did it grow? Did it get attention? If it worked, it was successful. If it didn't, it failed. That felt simple, but this part of the course complicated that idea in a good way. One of the strongest lessons for me was this: innovation usually doesn't fail because the idea is weak, it fails because the alignment is weak. Alignment between real human needs, organizational readiness, and timing. That made me step back. I realized how often innovation is treated as technical problem, but in a reality it's a human and systematic one. Another shift for me was understanding that successful innovation is rarely linear. It's not a straight line from idea to impact. It's experimentation, feedback loops, constant reassessment. This challenged my earlier belief that good planning alone leads to success. Instead, I started to see uncertainty differently, not as a risk that needs to be eliminated, but as something that needs to be worked with. What stood out to me most was the idea that the failure is not opposite of success, it's a part of it. That reframing changed how I relate to failures. It made me more comfortable testing ideas early and accelerating outcomes that are incomplete. Innovations, in the sense, becomes less about perfection and more about learning speed. I also noticed a shift in how I evaluate ideas. I stopped asking, is this innovative? And started asking, who is this for? And what problem does it genuinely solve? That question connects directly back to human needs and to the role of the change agent. Without that grounding, innovation risks becoming novelty rather than value. Looking ahead, this has shaped how I imagine myself working with innovation. I no longer see success as launching something impressive. I see it as sustaining something meaningful. For me, successful innovation is not defined by speed or skill alone, but by relevance, adaptability, and long term impact. Now I want to talk about failure and rejection, week 43. So it was the point where everything I had learned stopped being theoretical. Up to until then, I was mostly analyzing innovations from a safe distance. This week pushed me into a situation where rejection wasn't just possible, it was almost guaranteed. In the first task, I tested whether I could sell my programming course to high school in Malmo. Because it was framed as a failure assignment, something unexpected happened. I wasn't afraid of failing. That sense of psychological safety completely changed how I behaved. I committed fully, I've reached out, I spoke with teachers, I explained my idea. And even though I didn't secure a sale, I ended up with meaningful conversation and even the principal's email for further contact. What I learned here was subtle but very powerful. When the fear of failure is removed, effort increases. Failure didn't stop momentum, it actually created it. The second experience, the 24-hour business context, made rejections even more real. Working in a team with only 100 SEK, we had to act fast. Our first plan failed immediately. We realized that the basic cable we needed would cost more than our entire budget, so we pivoted. We bought chocolates and we tried to sell them. This was a rejection in its raw form. Many people said no. Some didn't even want to engage. And then, unexpectedly, an elderly woman who was on a bus asked what we were doing. She listened and she bought all of our chocolates. That moment stayed with me, not because of the money, but because it revealed how unpredictable human response really is. Rejection is not always about a bad idea. Often it's about timing, context, and who happens to be listening. Finally, the change agent dialogue helped me make sense of these experiences. Watching and reflecting on curated videos, themes like resistance, discomfort, and persistence stopped feeling abstract. They felt personal. I realized that being a change agent is not about avoiding rejection, it's about staying present despite it. Week 43 changed how I experience failure. I no longer see it as something to protect myself from. I see it as something to move through. Rejections became information, not judgment. And that shift more than my model or the framework. It's something I will carry with me beyond this course. Lastly, focusing on who I am becoming, when I look back at this course as a whole, I realize that what changed most is not what I know, it's how I relate to uncertainty. I entered this course looking for clarity, for tools, for the right answers. What I leave with is something different, a tolerance for not knowing and the confidence to act anyway. Learning about human needs taught me to slow down before solving. Exploring the change agent mindset taught me that listening is often more powerful than persuading. And experiencing failure and rejection taught me that action matters more than comfort. Together, these experiences reshaped how I understand innovation. I no longer see it as a performance or a moment of brilliance. I see it as practice, a practice that requires curiosity, humility, and repeated engagement with real people. This course has also changed how I imagine myself in the future. I don't see myself as someone who always has the best idea in the room. I see myself as someone who asks better questions, tests assumptions early, and is willing to learn in public rather than in isolation. If I take one thing forward from this course, it is this: meaningful change does not come from avoiding failures, rejections, or uncertainty. It comes from staying present through them. That is the kind of change agent I want to become in the future.